There was nothing but darkness all around me. I was straining to see even the tiniest glimmer of light, but I couldn't. There were people talking, laughing, shouting, and their voices should have brought me comfort, but they didn't. There was a tang in the air, fresh lemons and aromatic spices, garlic, ginger, oregano. I reached out in front of me and I touched something solid. It was cool and smooth. Now, I bet you're wondering where on earth I was, so let me explain. 3 months earlier, a colleague of mine had recommended I try a restaurant in London called Don Noir, which I now roughly translate as, damn, it's dark in here. And that's the whole point. It's a restaurant where you eat in the dark and you're served by people who are either blind or partially sighted. I made a reservation, and just a few weeks later, I found myself stood in the corridor outside the dining room, waiting to go in with my partner and a group of people we'd never met before. Dan, our waiter, came along and introduced himself. He said that he would be with us throughout the evening, and he had just 2 requests. The first, that we always listen out for the sound of his voice. And the second, that we follow his instructions to the letter. He said his first job was to get us seated in the dining room. So he asked that we form an orderly queue and put our hand on the shoulder of the person in front. As I reached up to put my hand on the shoulder of a very tall stranger, my stomach started to do somersaults and I felt sick. It was the exact same feeling I get every time my children demand I go on a roller coaster ride with them. I started to think of reasons to extricate myself from the situation, but unfortunately Dan's voice interrupted and said it was time to go in. We slowly shuffled forward, almost like we were doing the conga, and as Dan pulled back a thick black velvet curtain, he said, "You're going to be okay. You've got this." We shuffled forward some more, and Dan closed the curtain. I took 2 deep breaths and slowly looked up, but I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black. In that moment, I had temporarily lost my sight. So what should have been a bit of an adventure in London, I mean, I go to sleep every night in the dark. Surely I should be able to go to a restaurant in the dark, was turning into something quite different. And in those first few moments of losing my sight, I realized 2 things. The first, that I do have an absolute fear of the dark. And the second, that in losing my sight, I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me, like I'd lost all control and I didn't know what to do. And I've always been fascinated why, as human beings, we choose to respond differently to times of adversity, challenges, toxic situations. Why is it that sometimes we know exactly what we need to do to get through, but on other occasions we feel completely overwhelmed and stuck? Over the past 20 years, I've spent my time working with teams, large and small, and coaching individuals one-to-one. And I've found that there is one contributing factor that impacts our response, and it's our mindset and the belief that we have about ourselves. Consequently, I've developed the fish climb trees philosophy, which helps people move from that place of feeling they can't to one where they absolutely know they can, and therefore they build their resilience. I explore this philosophy in my book, When Fish Climb Trees. Now, we first meet some of the fish as they're flailing around on the banks of a river, which in itself is perhaps even more bizarre than the whole concept of fish climbing trees. But what we don't know at that point is those fish had been incredibly brave, because the water in the river was toxic. It was slowly killing them. So they had a choice. They could stay stuck where they were, knowing that they faced certain death, or they could choose to do something different. And let's think about this in our own lives for a moment. When you've faced adversity, challenges, toxic situations, how have you dealt with it? Have you known what you needed to do to get through? Have you had the resilience? Or have you felt stuck? Back in Don Le Noir, I was certainly feeling stuck. So I chose to do something different. I chose to put my faith in Dan. Because whilst this was an environment that was clearly very toxic for me, it was one where he was thriving. Dan was a man with a plan, and I put my faith in him, and he did not let me down. In fact, he expertly led us to our table. And after carefully and cautiously feeling our way around, we eventually plonked ourselves down with a sigh of relief. Only to realise that we weren't on a lovely, intimate table for two, but sat with people we didn't know. My worst nightmare. And as we were adjusting to our new environment, making ourselves feel comfortable, 4 warm voices greeted us, wanting to know everything about us, who we were, where we were from, what we did. Fortunately, they had no clue what was going on inside my head, so they continued to chat away to us. And actually, what happened was we had a fantastic evening with these people. And maybe because we were sat in the dark, there were none of those awful first date moments, you know, the awkward silences or surreptitiously looking someone up and down, deciding the job that they do, how much money they earn, whether they're a good or bad person. All we could do was listen to the sound of their voice and what they were saying. And when we think about what's going on in the world around us today, wouldn't that be a wonderful approach? If we stopped judging people by their physical attributes, their height, their weight, the colour of their skin, and just listened to the words that they spoke. So what would have been an awful evening turned into something quite different. We had oodles and oodles of laughter, so much so that it didn't matter when I inadvertently knocked a glass of wine all over myself and the table. To this day, I have no clue whether I spilt wine on anyone else because I couldn't see. And there was even a moment when I was glad we were in the dark. As we sat down, Dan had said that when our food arrived, we may want to eat with our fingers. Of course, we balked at the idea of that. But when our food arrived on what was like an airline-style tray, or something you might get when you're in prison, I found that I could find my fork. I could find the food. I could even put the food on my fork. But what I seemed incapable of doing, even after years and years of practice, was moving that fork to my mouth. Honestly, really difficult. Try it at home. I promise you, it's so hard. So after several failed attempts and realising my pristine white blouse probably resembled a baby's bib when they're trying solids for the first time, I gave in and I gave up. And I ate with my fingers. Boy, was I glad no one could see me. But it was worth it because the chocolate raspberries we had for dessert were delicious. And it wasn't long before we had to say goodbye to these 4 lovely people that we'd met. And it was only once they were gone that we realised that Don Le Noir had yet another lesson in store for us. Because if you had asked me before that evening, would I be able to have a fantastic time with 4 people I'd never met before and not be able to recognise them if I passed them on the street? I would have said, of course not, don't be silly. But that's exactly what happened. And you may be in the audience today, and I apologise if I don't recognise you. But that's a reality. Sometimes the impossible is absolutely possible. And that's what my brave fish show us, the fish that escaped the toxic river. They did so because they believed there was something better out there for them. And no matter what the challenge is, they were going to get there. And they were absolutely right, because the philosophy takes you from the toxic river to the legacy lake. And the legacy lake is where you live out your hopes and dreams, whatever it is you want. And for my fish, it was finding an abundance of cool, clean, clear water to live out their days happy. So why was it that some of my fish did that, but some of them chose to stay stuck in the toxic river? Well, they did that because of the beliefs they had about themselves. Now, I call these beliefs fishnets. Now, they're not this type of fishnet. Oh, no. They are this fishnet. This fishnet then can keep fish stuck where they are, stuck believing that they can't get to their legacy lake, unable to break through their fishnets and develop their resilience. So just for a moment, I'd like you to imagine you were this fish. In your life right now, what are the fishnets that are holding you back from getting to your legacy lake? After we said goodbye to our lovely friends, we had an opportunity to chat to Dan because we were keen to find out what it was like to be a blind man living and working in London. And he said he absolutely loved his life. He'd been with the restaurant since it first opened. And before that, he'd been a filing clerk. He'd lost his sight when he was just a young lad, but he never let that hold him back. He never wanted to be defined by his disability. He wanted to live the life that we live as sighted people, and that's what he was doing. But can you imagine the fishnets that he had to break through in order to do that? And in all the work that I've done with individuals, teams, and organizations, there is one fishnet that I believe every single one of us has experienced at some time in our life. No matter where we are, what we do, we've experienced it. And it's the fishnet of not feeling good enough. Now, a few years ago, I was down the pub on a Friday night with my mate Tim, celebrating the fact that I'd got my first director level position. And now the thing you need to know about Tim is he's a really cool guy. He's a snazzy dresser, he's a lovely person, and he's managed to climb the career ladder without forfeiting his work-life balance. Oh, and he also wears the most amazing coloured socks, no matter what the situation. So we were there, he was there with his pint of Guinness, I was there with my chilled glass of wine, chatting about life. And we got onto the subject of my new job. And first of all, I couldn't believe I'd got the job. When were they going to find out that I really shouldn't have had it? And then I started worrying about the bigger targets, the bigger budget, the different remit. And it was clear I was getting caught up in my own fishnets. And Tim said to me, you know what, Mel? Sometimes I feel like that. You do? Yeah, I absolutely do. But I have a hack. Really? What is it? Well, I've been researching it for years. It's phenomenally beneficial. I've even written a couple of academic papers about it. That's how much I believe in it. Great. Do you want to know what it is? Absolutely. Well, when I'm feeling stuck, when I don't know what to do, this is what I do. And as we fell about laughing, and the rest of the pub looked on wondering whether they should call security, he said, honestly, Mel, blowing a raspberry changes your physiology, which means that you can no longer feel stuck. I've tried it, it works, I recommend it. Because you want to break through your fishnets. You want to be like Dan, the man with a plan. And you want to be like my brave fish, who did get to their legacy lake. In order to get there, they needed to climb some trees. So they built various contraptions. They built the slingshot, the elevator, and the finternet. It's a book about fish, sorry. And sometimes they were successful, but sometimes they weren't. But they never let that hold them back, because each time they failed, they knew they were building their resilience, and they could get to their legacy lake. And they did, just as you can. You can break through your fishnets and you can get to your legacy lake. Because as Dan said to me that night, you've got this and you're going to be okay. And you are. Thank you.